Hey guys, tonight we explore the far less glamorous side of medieval travel. Not knights, not gilded coaches, but the very real question of where your average, slightly muddy peasant would sleep if they dared venture more than a few miles from home. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, the modern equivalent of livestock snoring in the next stall, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Leaving your village as a poor peasant in the Middle Ages was not something one did lightly. It was more like announcing to the world, I'm about to suffer recreationally. Because unlike nobles with their squadrons of servants, horses and backup shoes, you were likely walking barefoot with a sack full of anxiety and maybe an onion. Most peasants didn't travel far. Why would they? The village had everything. Bad bread, debt, religious guilt, and the same 7 people you'd known since birth. But if duty called, a pilgrimage, seasonal labour, or running from your landlord's henchmen, you packed your things. Things here meaning a crust of bread, a rag cloak, and a stick for both walking and warding off geese. Journeys were long. Maps were for monks and pirates. If you didn't have a good sense of direction, you were basically just wandering until someone yelled at you in a different dialect. Distances were measured in how long until your feet start bleeding and number of times you consider sleeping in a bush. Before departure, you might ask your village priest for a blessing, ideally one that covered wolves, demons, bandits, dysentery, and overly curious farmers' daughters. If the priest liked you, he might even give you half a turnip and a worried look. Very supportive. Then came the goodbye ritual. A solemn wave from your grandmother, who was 38 but looked 93. A warning from your cousin not to get eaten, and your younger siblings trying to steal the bread out of your pocket as a send-off gift. You walked. You trudged. You regretted everything. The road was muddy, filled with carts, animals, and the occasional knight who might trample you on principle. Every mile brought new questions. Am I lost? Is that man asleep or dead? And was this a bad idea? Yes, and definitely yes. But still, you pushed on. Why? Because you had no choice. Or because your cousin said there was work in the next village. Or because a relic salesman said your sins would vanish if you walked to a monastery 3 days away. Spoiler, they didn't. And thus began your medieval journey, broke, barefoot, and with a level of optimism only possible before the blisters set in. So, you've walked all day, your feet are now more blister than flesh, and you've passed exactly 0 inns willing to house a penniless traveller who smells like damp thatch and existential regret. Time to consider the medieval peasant's most reliable shelter. The barn. Yes, the humble barn. A structure built for creatures with hooves, but frequently repurposed by creatures with poor life choices and no coin. Barns had everything a peasant could ever want in overnight accommodation. A roof, straw that wasn't entirely mouldy, and large, flat animals that radiated warmth and judgment in equal measure. But don't just wander into any old barn. First, you must engage in the sacred ritual of asking the farmer, which involved knocking on the door and praying they were sober, not armed, and didn't already have 3 strangers sleeping in their hayloft. If they said yes, congratulations. You were now the proud guest of a cow, 6 chickens, and whatever rats hadn't left for the season. Sleeping in a barn was not without its perks. The straw was scratchy, but better than dirt, and if you curled up between 2 docile oxen, your body temperature might actually rise above medieval corpse. Of course, if one of them rolled over, your travel plans might end permanently. There were also smells, deep, layered, emotional smells. Barns had a scent profile that ranged from fresh hay to barnyard cologne number 5. You didn't so much fall asleep as pass out from olfactory overload. And then came the sounds. Pigs snorting, horses chewing, and the eternal rhythmic creaking of some wooden beam that definitely sounded like it was judging your life decisions. Add in the occasional flea circus performing beneath your shirt, and you had all the makings of a cosy rural nightmare. Still, beggars and peasants couldn't be choosers. A barn meant you wouldn't freeze to death, get rained on, or be devoured by nocturnal wildlife. And come dawn, you might even get a chunk of stale bread as thanks for not stepping on the goose. In the grand hierarchy of peasant lodging, barn sat squarely between miracle and wet log. And compared to what's next on the list, sleeping outdoors, it was practically a 5-star inn. So the barn door was locked, the monastery turned you away, and the local innkeeper laughed so hard at your empty coin pouch he nearly choked on his own spit. That means only one thing. Tonight, dear traveller, you're sleeping outdoors. Let's start with the field. A classic. Flat, spacious, full of grass and cows. Lots of cows. You might find a soft patch to lie on, assuming it's not already claimed by cow dung or thistles, which were Mother Nature's medieval equivalent of bedbugs. If you were smart, or just cowardly enough to avoid angry farmers, you aimed for the edge of a field. That way you minimised the risk of being trampled by livestock or chased off by a man named Godric, wielding a pitchfork and personal grudges. Then there were forests, an excellent option if you wanted your sleeping experience to include paranoia. Forests were quiet, yes, but in the way haunted houses are quiet. Every twig snap became a murder mystery. Every owl hoot sounded sarcastic. You didn't sleep so much as enter a shallow coma with one eye open. Plus, medieval forests were full of charming characters like wolves, bandits, and, if you asked the local priest, probably Satan himself. The wind through the trees could be soothing, but also suspicious. If you made it through the night without frostbite or tooth marks, you considered it a win. Still, some peasants actually preferred the open air, especially in warmer months. The stars were free to look at, unlike everything else, and the breeze helped mask the smell of your own unwashed body. Sure, it was damp, cold, and offered zero protection from bugs the size of regret, but at least no one charged you rent. To create a bit of comfort, some travellers carried cloaks or old blankets, emphasis on old. Most were made of rough wool, smelled like regret, and had the insulating power of a slice of cabbage. If you curled up into a fetal position and muttered prayers to Saint whoever was on duty, you might even sleep for a few hours. Let's say you've already been turned away from the tavern because you couldn't afford a mug of watered-down ale, or the landlord didn't appreciate your aura of hopeless poverty. You've tried the fields, the forests, the barns, and now you're eyeing the one place that might offer both peace and a lower risk of being kicked in the ribs by a goat. The churchyard. Yes, welcome to sanctified sleeping, the hallowed ground where the righteous rest in eternal peace. And you, the travelling peasant, try to get a few hours without accidentally rolling into a grave. Churchyards were surprisingly popular among the itinerant peasant class. Why? Because they were public, semi-protected, and the dead rarely complained. Sleeping near holy ground was thought to provide spiritual protection, or at the very least, discourage bandits. After all, even the most hardened thief might think twice before robbing someone within sneeze distance of a saint's femur. Of course, there were risks. Local clergy didn't always appreciate vagrants turning their graveyards into medieval campgrounds. You might be awakened by a furious monk or a nun with a broom and zero patience. And if it was near a feast day or market, you weren't alone. The churchyard could resemble a crowded slumber party for the deeply uncomfortable and unwashed. Still, there were perks. Some churches had sheltered porches, called lich gates, where travellers could sleep relatively dry, assuming the wind didn't treat your blanket like an open invitation to misery. And there was always the hope that a kindly priest might take pity on you and offer some soup or bread, especially if you looked particularly tragic or had a good sob story involving sick goats. If it rained, the graves offered a kind of ironic comfort. "At least I'm not that guy," you'd mutter, curled next to a mossy stone, soaked but alive. Nothing like sleeping atop the departed to really drive home how much worse things could be. And who knows? Maybe you'd absorb some residual holiness through proximity, or just fleas from the grass. Either way, it beat fighting over a dry patch of mud in the alley behind the butcher's stall. Churchyards. Because sometimes divine intervention looks like a mossy bench and a stern warning from Father Gregory. When you were too broke for an inn, too cold for the woods, and too emotionally fragile to sleep next to a corpse in a churchyard, there was one last bastion of hope: the monastery. Yes, the solemn stone sanctuaries of men who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and regrettable haircuts. These were places where weary travellers might find a meal, a floor, and a solid 8 hours of being silently judged by men who voluntarily gave up shoes. Now, let's be clear. Monasteries were not medieval bed and breakfasts. You didn't just waltz up and ask for a room with a view and a side of mead. You waited politely at the gate, often for hours, until a monk decided you weren't a heretic, a bandit, or, worst of all, a talkative heretic. If you passed this test, you'd be admitted under the ancient rule of hospitality. Treat the stranger as Christ, which sounds lovely, until you realise it also meant cold floors, shared soup, and being woken at 3 a.m. by chanting that sounded like Gregorian monks arguing with bees. Monks fed you what they ate, mostly bread, watery vegetables, and something pretending to be broth. If it had a flavour, it was probably penance. But after a day of chewing on air and disappointment, even boiled leeks felt like a feast. Just don't ask for seconds. That's how you get extra prayers instead of extra portions. Sleeping accommodations varied. Some monasteries had dedicated guest halls, which is a generous term for a long room with benches, hay, and the faint scent of damp wool and sanctity. You'd sleep among strangers, all trying not to cough too loudly and anger the friar with a broom. If the monastery was poor or overcrowded, you might be told to sleep in the cloister, essentially a stone hallway with spiritual acoustics and wind that whistled the Daisirai. Still, monks didn't ask for money. All they expected in return was that you didn't steal anything, didn't blaspheme near the relics, and maybe confessed your sins, which, after 5 nights outdoors, probably included envy, wrath, and thinking about murdering a chicken. Was it luxurious? No, but it was dry, quiet, and came with just enough guilt to keep you humble. So your feet are blistered, your shoes gave up 2 villages ago, and the barn owl you tried to share a tree with last night nearly pecked your nose off. Welcome to the real medieval Airbnb, the roadside shrine. These weren't grand cathedrals or even modest chapels, more like holy vending machines. Little stone or wooden structures, sometimes containing a statue of the Virgin Mary, a local saint, or a chunk of something someone swore was once part of a martyr's femur. Positioned at crossroads or along pilgrimage routes, they served 2 main purposes: to inspire piety and to provide just enough cover for a nap without being rained on. For poor peasants on the move, these shrines became sacred snooze booths. If you were lucky, the overhang would be big enough to sit under. Even better, to huddle with your knees to your chest and pretend that damp stone was a mattress. And while shrines didn't offer food, bedding, or bathrooms, they did offer one priceless thing: plausible deniability. If someone found you snoring at the foot of St. Mildred, you could always claim to be praying. Loudly. In your sleep. Now, of course, not every shrine welcomed freeloading travellers. Some were lovingly maintained by villagers who didn't appreciate your muddy presence ruining the aesthetic. But others were so remote that even the squirrels had forgotten them. For a weary traveller, that was basically 5-star luxury. It helped that no one wanted to rob a shrine. Bad luck, you see. Bandits might risk their souls for a merchant's pouch, but they drew the line at stealing next to a painted icon of St. Jerome with laser eyes and a passive-aggressive smirk. There was also a spiritual side. Sleeping near a shrine gave you that faint sense of moral safety, as if the saint would personally intervene if something tried to eat you. Of course, this wasn't guaranteed. St. Hubert might protect you from werewolves, but probably not from trenchfoot or aggressive squirrels. And yet, despite the cold, the rocks, and the faint smell of damp holiness, roadside shrines remained a favoured fallback. Not because they were comfortable, but because they weren't worse. By the 7th blister, the 15th, no room, go away. And the 3rd time you were chased out of a barn by a donkey with boundary issues, you start to fantasize about a real bed, or at least a roof, or soup. That's when the warm, flickering glow of an alehouse window starts to look less like a building and more like a divine apparition with beer breath. Alehouses and taverns were the medieval version of the truck stop. Cheap drinks, questionable company, and enough body heat inside to steam up a window with sheer collective regret. But for the travelling peasant, they were also one of the few indoor options where you didn't have to pretend to be holy or fluent in monk. Let's get one thing straight. You couldn't just walk in and sleep on the bench. If you had coin, you were welcome. If you didn't, well, the door had a wonderful creak to it as it slammed in your face. The drink was the star of the show. Ale, beer, mead, whatever the local yeast could be convinced to ferment. Many a peasant would order a single cup and nurse it for hours, hoping to avoid being thrown out. Sometimes, the more charitable innkeepers allowed weary travellers to sleep by the hearth for the price of a drink and a story. Other times, they charged a few pennies for a straw bed in a corner, shared, of course, with whoever else had enough change and body odour. Privacy was a fantasy. You'd sleep shoulder to shoulder with strangers who snored like war horses and mumbled confessions in their sleep. The floor was sticky, the benches uneven, and the fireplace smoke a constant reminder that oxygen is a luxury. But it was warm, and if you closed your eyes tight enough, you could pretend the rats were just small, curious cats. Sometimes there were songs, sometimes fights. Occasionally, both at once. But even amid the shouting and spilled ale, there was a strange comfort in it all, a reminder that you were still part of the grand, grimy flow of humanity. Taverns, where warmth cost money, but sleep came free with enough ale. Picture this. It's getting dark, the wolves are howling, or maybe just some very aggressive sheep, and your options are down to sleep in a puddle or knock on the door of a stranger who probably hasn't had a bath since Easter. Time to activate the peasant's final survival strategy, begging for shelter. This wasn't quite the modern Airbnb experience. There were no reviews, no app, and certainly no fresh linens. It was more like a roulette wheel with fleas. You picked a house that didn't look too murdery, walked up humbly, and pleaded with whoever answered the door for a place by the fire. If you were lucky, the owner would take pity on your blistered feet and let you in. If you were unlucky, they'd let the dog answer instead. Some families, especially in rural areas, were more hospitable. Maybe they remembered what it was like to travel, or maybe they just liked the gossip that came with hosting a stranger. A good story was worth more than a hot bath after all, mostly because no one remembered what hot baths were. You'd usually be given the least offensive corner of the house, near the hearth if you were lucky, near the goat pen if you weren't. Bedding ranged from straw and an old cloak to a suspiciously crunchy pile of rags. But at least it was indoors. You might even get a meal, a hunk of bread, maybe some root vegetable stew, and water that didn't glow in the dark. In return, you were expected to behave like a saint. No stealing, no eyeing the daughter, and definitely no suspicious noises after curfew. You were also expected to be up and gone by sunrise, lest you overstay your welcome and transition from grateful guest to suspicious squatter. Of course, this all relied on trust, which in the medieval world was about as sturdy as a three-legged stool in a thunderstorm. But somehow, it worked. Communities took pride in their occasional generosity, and travellers learned the fine art of being humble, thankful, and invisible by morning. It wasn't glamorous, but it beat sleeping in a ditch with judgmental frogs. There comes a point in every peasant's journey when desperation meets innovation. The night is too cold, the barn is full of angry cows, and the shrine has already been claimed by someone who snores like a demon gargling gravel. What's left? The marketplace. By day, medieval markets were a chaotic symphony of shouting vendors, twitchy animals, questionable cheese, and the occasional pickpocket who thought subtlety was optional. But by night, a ghost town, littered with empty stalls, overturned carts, and maybe a half-eaten turnip if you were lucky. In other words, prime real estate. The wooden stalls were often just frames with thatched or cloth roofs, more decorative than weatherproof. But they did offer shelter from wind and rain, and if you didn't mind the smell of onions and old fish, and honestly, if you were a medieval peasant you didn't, They were perfectly adequate for a night's sleep. Just tuck yourself under the counter, wrap up in whatever sack you were using as a coat, and try not to dream about roast meat. There was also a strategic benefit. Markets were central. They were near roads, churches, taverns, and occasionally, if you were in a fancy town, a public latrine that only smelled mildly hellish. Sleeping there gave you a head start in the morning, up with the sun, gone before the fishmongers arrived swinging slabs of trout like disciplinary tools. Of course, there were risks. Some towns had night watchmen who didn't take kindly to unlicensed snoozing. If caught, you might be scolded, kicked awake, or, worse, asked to explain yourself using complete sentences. And then there were the animals, stray dogs, opportunistic rats, and geese. Never underestimate medieval geese. They were loud, territorial, and had a personal vendetta against anything that moved. Still, it beat sleeping in the mud, and sometimes vendors would even leave behind scraps or stale bread, too crusty for customers, but just right for someone who hadn't chewed anything solid since Tuesday. Market sheds weren't built for comfort, but they were there. They were mostly dry, and best of all, they didn't ask questions. In the medieval world, there was one kind of travel that came with a mildly increased chance of sleeping indoors. Pilgrimage. Say you were off to Canterbury, Santiago, or some obscure saint's elbow bone shrine in the middle of nowhere. Congratulations, you just unlocked medieval travel's only loyalty program. Pilgrim hostels, also called hospitia, xenodochia, or just the place that smells like sandalwood and feet, were religious guest houses specifically for the holy wanderer. Run by monks, nuns, or locals trying to score points with heaven, these places offered shelter, soup, and the sweet promise of not dying in a ditch. All you needed was a pilgrim's badge, a little token or emblem proving that you were indeed walking for Jesus and not just avoiding your landlord. These badges were the medieval equivalent of a backstage pass. Wear one, and doors might just open. Forget one, and you were just another vagrant with sore feet and suspicious eyes. Inside the hostel, luxuries varied. You might get a straw mattress, a wool blanket, or if you really struck spiritual gold, a shared bed in a drafty upper room. Clean sheets? Hilarious. Privacy? That's for nobles and heretics. But it was warmish, dryish, and the food, while often just soup that waved at a vegetable, was free-ish. Monks were usually the hosts, which meant a few things. Prayer at dawn, silence at supper, and absolutely no funny business. Pilgrims were expected to behave like saints, even if they smelled like goats. If you were caught stealing, lying, or flirting too enthusiastically with the icon of St. Cuthbert, you'd be out faster than a heretic at a bonfire. Still, for the weary poor, pilgrim hostels were a blessing, one of the few places you could count on some measure of safety and care. They were little sanctuaries on the winding road of medieval chaos. The takeaway? If you had sore feet, spiritual angst, and a convincing story about a vision involving the Virgin Mary and 3 geese, you could rest easy, at least for one night. Ah, the medieval noble estate, home to fine tapestries, roast swan, courtly intrigue, and a backyard full of peasants trying to sleep discreetly next to the manure heap. Yes, for the particularly bold traveller, noble lands offered opportunity, so long as you understood your place, and that place was very much behind the stables. Now, you weren't exactly strolling up to the castle and asking for a room. That sort of thing got you crossbowed. But noble estates were vast. Manor houses, fields, storehouses, livestock pens, and crucially, outbuildings. The stables, granaries, haylofts, and tool sheds provided cover, warmth, and, if you were lucky, a goat that didn't mind company. If you had a good sob story and the luck to catch a charitable steward, you might even be granted official permission to stay, briefly. Nobles liked to show off their Christian piety now and then, and allowing a peasant not to freeze to death was one of the less expensive ways to earn divine favour. But let's be honest, most peasants didn't ask. They skulked. They found a low wall, a patch of dry grass, or the lee of a building, and curled up like a guilty hedgehog. Behind the stables was a favourite, warm from the animals, shielded from wind, and bonus. Nobody wanted to hang out near horse droppings at night anyway. Instant privacy. Risks abounded, of course. If a guard spotted you, you might be chased off or roughed up, depending on how bored he was. If the noble was particularly paranoid, you might be accused of being a poacher, a thief, or just too scruffy to be tolerated. And if the livestock didn't like you, well, let's just say being kicked by a medieval donkey was a character-building experience. Still, for the desperate, noble lands were tempting. They had resources, fences, and a tendency to leave things lying around unsupervised. Just don't touch the apples, or the pigs, or the fence, or anything really. Be invisible, be quiet, and move on before dawn, because nothing ruins a noble's breakfast quite like discovering an unconscious peasant snoring behind the compost pile. In the great medieval game of where can I sleep without dying or paying, abandoned buildings were the jackpot. Sure, they were collapsing, full of rats, and almost certainly cursed. But did we mention they were free? The beauty of an abandoned cottage, burnt-out smithy, or ruined mill was that no one cared. Nobles didn't send guards after you, monks didn't expect you to pray, and tavern keepers didn't charge you a kidney for a bowl of gruel. If you could get past the gaping holes in the roof and the unsettling whispers when the wind blew through the rafters, you were golden. These structures were often relics of better, or at least less plague-ridden times. A village abandoned during the Black Death? Ghost town. A watchtower no longer needed because the invading horde got bored? Empty and scenic. That old bathhouse that burned down after someone lit a candle near the oils? Smelled weird, but hey, 4 walls are 4 walls. Peasants didn't ask questions. They saw a roof, partial, a door, optional, and floor space, rat-infested, but still space. You stuffed some straw in a corner, maybe used your sack as a pillow, and hoped the spirit of whatever peasant died there before you was feeling generous. Of course, medieval superstition didn't help. Everyone knew abandoned places were haunted. That's why they were abandoned. Wailing noises? Must be a ghost? Cold draft? Ghost? Creepy goat staring through the window at 3 a.m? Probably a ghost. But also probably just a goat? Probably. Still, if you were poor and travelling, haunted buildings were often safer than sleeping out in the open. They offered shelter from rain, wind, wolves, and worse, other humans. And occasionally, they came with forgotten tools, a bit of leftover grain, or firewood left behind by a previous squatter, who either found better lodgings, or was eaten by the chimney spirit. You didn't brag about staying in these places. You didn't make eye contact with them in daylight. But when night fell, and you were cold, alone, and one sore ankle away from collapsing, an abandoned hovel was a gift from the gods, or at least from someone who wasn't coming back. In the grand tapestry of medieval life, stitched with famine, plague, and people tossing chamber pots out of windows, there existed, believe it or not, the occasional kind stranger. Not often, mind you. But every once in a while, a peasant traveller hit the lottery and met someone who didn't immediately treat them like lice in human form. These rare individuals came in various shapes. An old widow who remembered what it was like to be poor, a tired farmer who had an extra crust of bread and a half-cleared barn, or a pious merchant who genuinely believed Matthew 25:35 wasn't just decorative Latin. Whatever the reason, they saw a stranger, raised an eyebrow, and said, "All right, you can sleep near the pig?" Sleep. No one expected a feather bed or roasted goose. But a roof, a fire, and something vaguely edible? That was a medieval miracle. In return, the peasant usually offered to chop wood, fetch water, or pretend to understand the host's complaints about the tax collector. Of course, not every kind stranger was purely altruistic. Sometimes kindness came with a request. Watch the kids, scare off wolves, help fix a wheelbarrow that last saw maintenance during the Crusades. Still, it was a fair trade compared to being mugged by bandits or eaten by wild dogs. The danger, naturally, was that not every stranger who looked kind was. There were scams, traps, and the occasional innkeeper who'd let you sleep under his roof, then accidentally forget to mention the lice infestation until you'd already started scratching. But those were just the risks of the road. Word of mouth helped. Villagers whispered names of good folk. Old Marta near the river. Brother Anselm 2 valleys over. That weird shepherd with a soft spot for travellers and sheep alike. These weren't hostels. They were whispers of hope, scattered across the map like breadcrumbs. So yes, sometimes the desperate traveller found a fire, a bowl of stew, and a smile that didn't look suspicious. And in a world where trust was as rare as fresh bread in February, that meant everything. Just don't overstay your welcome. Even kindness had a checkout time. Let's clear one thing up right away. When we say poor peasants slept with animals, we're talking about proximity, not passion. This isn't 50 Shades of Hay. It's about survival. Cold, damp, wheezing in the dark survival. Because when winter came knocking, and the only thing between you and hypothermia was a pig named Marjorie, you cuddled up and tried not to think about the smell. Animals were medieval central heating. Cows, sheep, goats, and pigs radiated warmth like big wheezing radiators that occasionally tried to eat your bedding. In many peasant homes, especially those humble enough to qualify as livestock inclusive, there wasn't much of a separation between living quarters and barn. The pig got one corner, you got the other, and the chicken wandered wherever it wanted because no one had the energy to argue with it. On the road, it was no different. Sleep near an ox cart? You've got wind protection and 2,000 pounds of beefy body heat. Find a roadside farm and charm your way into the barn? That's deluxe accommodation compared to sleeping under a tree with a wet sock and a grudge. Even a drafty goat shed beat shivering alone in the woods, unless the goat was territorial. Some were. You learned that the hard way. Sure, there were drawbacks. Lice, fleas, questionable smells, midnight noises that made you rethink your life choices. But in the peasant economy of shelter, beggars couldn't be sniffy. And if you could manage not to roll into the cow's personal space and get kicked into next week, it was a surprisingly effective survival strategy. Occasionally, you even bonded with the animals. That sheep that didn't trample your foot? She was your new best friend. The donkey that didn't bite when you leaned on it for warmth? Practically family. The pig that snorted at your snoring but let you stay? A saint. Sleeping with animals wasn't just common, it was smart, practical, and in many ways, more dependable than humans. Animals didn't judge your patched tunic, ask invasive questions, or demand coins you didn't have. They just existed, snorted, and kept you warm, which, in the grand medieval scheme of things, made them excellent roommates. So you made it. You trudged through mud, slept beside goats, begged bread crusts from strangers, got sneezed on by monks, and maybe didn't get robbed every night. Congratulations. Now you get to do it all over again, in reverse. The return journey for a poor peasant wasn't some glorious homecoming. It was more like retracing your own bad decisions while slightly more dehydrated and 30% more lice-infested. You weren't just tired. You were spiritually, emotionally, and physically deflated, like a wine bladder that's been stepped on by a mule. And yet, somehow, you were wiser. Not in the way nobles are wise after reading Cicero by a fire. No, you were peasant-wise. You knew which barns had the soft hay, which roadside shrines didn't reek of goat urine, and which taverns had innkeepers who didn't water down the ale too much. You even had a mental map of which dogs bite, and which just bark. Your expectations had also adjusted. Before, you were optimistic enough to think someone might offer you a bed. Now, you saw a dry ditch and thought, luxury, that soggy loaf of bread you traded for your last wooden spoon. Best deal I've made all week. And that monk who offered you soup and a 45-minute lecture on sin. At least it was warm. Perhaps the most painful part was knowing that no one back home would believe a word of it. Oh sure, they'd say. You slept in a churchyard, dined on beetroot soup with Benedictines, and avoided a plague outbreak by hiding under a broken wagon. Right. But in your lice-bitten, blister-ridden heart, you knew. You'd survived the medieval road. You'd faced hunger, cold, and awkward silences with donkeys. You'd made it through the medieval hospitality lottery and lived to tell the tale. Though you'd probably wait until after a bath. The journey changed you. Your tunic was torn, your dignity mildly eroded, and your feet. Best not to talk about your feet, but your worldview was broader. You knew the kindness of strangers, the utility of goats, and the spiritual redemption of sleeping in places you swore you'd never mention again. You left as a peasant. You returned as, well, still a peasant, but one with stories. And that's something. In Tudor England, fashion was never just fabric stitched together. It was a bold statement, a social contract worn on the body. Every ruff, every jewelled gown, every carefully chosen sleeve was a sentence in the ongoing dialogue of wealth, power, and hierarchy. Clothes spoke louder than words, and to dress was to communicate. The Tudors lived in a world where appearances mattered immensely, and the monarchy, ever eager to maintain order, ensured that fashion became a tightly controlled language. This language was enforced by the infamous sumptuary laws, which dictated exactly what could and could not be worn by each class of people. These regulations were not merely suggestions, they were legal commands. Velvet, for instance, was the preserve of nobility. If a common merchant dared to dress himself in such luxurious fabric, he risked being fined or publicly shamed. Purple dye, rare and expensive, was strictly reserved for royalty, while gold embroidery marked the highest ranks of society. Even furs were ranked, ermine and sable for nobles, while lower classes were confined to rabbit or fox. The cut of a sleeve or the shine of a jewel could instantly betray whether you were living above your station or daring to pretend you were. For the Tudors, clothing was also a theatre of loyalty. To dress in a manner approved by the crown was to show submission to the social hierarchy that held England together. A courtier in Henry VIII's court glittered like a walking jewel box, his slashed sleeves revealing glimpses of rich silks beneath, while his codpiece announced virility and confidence. Meanwhile, peasants trudged through muddy fields in rough-spun wool, their clothing practical, drab, and deliberately unadorned. The gulf between the classes was stitched into every seam. But it wasn't only about legality, it was about survival. One misstep in fashion could be interpreted as arrogance or rebellion. Wearing silk when you were not entitled to it suggested pretensions above your rank, a dangerous move in a kingdom where the monarch's authority was absolute. In this sense, fashion was a silent performance of obedience. To follow the code was to keep your place. To break it was to invite ruin. Tudor clothing, then, was not just about looking good. It was about living carefully in a world where fabric itself carried the weight of politics. If there was one piece of clothing that screamed Tudor, it was the ruff. At first, it was just a modest frill peeking out from the collar, a neat little frame for the face. But, like so many fashions born in Tudor England, it grew bigger, bolder, and more absurd with each passing decade. By the reign of Elizabeth I, ruffs had ballooned into architectural marvels of linen, lace, and starch, encircling the head like the halo of a saint, though they were less about holiness and more about status. Creating a proper ruff was no casual task. Each one required fine linen, often imported, which was then painstakingly starched and pleated into a perfect series of loops. The stiffer the ruff, the more fashionable it was. Some were edged with delicate lace, others embroidered with gold or silver thread. And they weren't just for women. Men, too, embraced the ruff with enthusiasm, turning their heads into floating discs of wealth and vanity. At court, the size of your ruff said as much about your ambition as your words ever could. But the ruff was more than decoration. It was a weapon of social distinction. The sheer impracticality of these collars meant that only the wealthy could afford them. After all, how could a farmer plough a field while wearing a collar wide enough to block his peripheral vision? The ruff was designed to separate the courtier from the commoner, to make it physically impossible for the elite to stoop, sweat, or labour. It was the fashion equivalent of shouting, "I don't work with my hands, I pay others to do that." Ruffs also demanded an army of maintenance. Servants had to wash, starch, and iron them with heated poking sticks to keep the folds crisp. A wrinkled or sagging ruff was a disaster, signalling laziness, or worse, poverty. In this way, the ruff acted like a social trap. Once you adopted the style, you had to keep investing in its upkeep or risk humiliation. And yet, beneath the ridiculousness, there was beauty. Ruffs framed faces like portraits, drawing attention to powdered skin and jewelled earrings. They symbolized the Tudor obsession with order and display, every fold identical, every crease deliberate. In the Tudor world, where appearances were everything, the ruff was the perfect metaphor. Uncomfortable, expensive, and completely unforgettable. Among the many eccentric fashions of the Tudors, few were as flamboyant, or as telling, as the slashed sleeve. At first glance, it might look like someone had taken a knife to their doublet in a fit of rage, leaving it tattered and ruined. But in truth, this was a carefully orchestrated style, a deliberate cut into fine outer fabric to reveal a more luxurious layer beneath. The idea originated on battlefields of continental Europe, where soldiers, short of proper clothing, hacked their worn garments to make space for captured silks and bright fabrics underneath. What began as a practical improvisation was soon elevated into a courtly fashion. In Tudor England, slashes became an art form. Noblemen strutted about with sleeves sliced into precise patterns, through which vibrant silk or velvet puffed out in contrast. It was clothing as spectacle, fabric turned into theatre. The slashed sleeve also carried symbolic weight. It was a display of wealth, announcing that the wearer could afford not just one expensive fabric, but two, and wastefully cut one to showcase the other. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, the very act of destroying valuable cloth to make a point was the height of extravagance. Only the privileged could indulge in such ostentation. And of course, sumptuary laws once again dictated who could slash and what fabrics they could display. A peasant imitating the trend might quickly find himself fined, or worse, mocked as a pretender. For women, slashing was no less elaborate. Gowns were cut open at sleeves or bodices, allowing contrasting undergarments to peek through. Combined with embroidery, jewels, and flowing ribbons, a woman's dress became a layered tapestry of colours and textures, designed to dazzle the eye. The effect was both playful and powerful, allowing wearers to manipulate attention. What was revealed and what remained hidden became a form of controlled seduction. Yet the practicality was almost non-existent. Slashed clothing snagged easily, required constant repair, and demanded skilled tailors to arrange the underlayers properly. But practicality was never the point. Tudor dress existed to proclaim, "I am wealthy enough to wear the impractical." Fashion was deliberately uncomfortable, deliberately difficult, because ease was the privilege of the labourer. The courtier's role was to impress, not to toil. Slashed sleeves, then, were more than mere decoration. They were a metaphor for Tudor life itself, an age of surface brilliance, carefully orchestrated display, and the constant tension between what was shown and what was concealed. If the ruff framed the face and slashed sleeves teased the eye, the jewelled gown was the full symphony of Tudor wealth on display. These gowns were not mere garments, they were walking treasuries, heavy with gemstones, pearls, embroidery, and precious metals stitched directly into the fabric. For Tudor women at court, especially queens and noble ladies, a gown was less about comfort and more about making a statement the moment they entered a room. Power, prestige, and divine favour. Take, for instance, Anne Boleyn, who understood better than most the language of clothing. She dazzled Henry VIII with her French-inspired gowns, rich in detail and exotic in flair. Elizabeth I, her daughter, elevated this to new heights. The Virgin Queen appeared in gowns so encrusted with pearls that foreign ambassadors reported her as a vision of light. Pearls, after all, symbolised purity, a calculated message for a monarch who styled herself as England's eternal maiden. Every jewel was propaganda, sewn not just into fabric, but into the imagination of all who gazed upon her. But the extravagance went beyond symbolism. it was also sheer intimidation. Jewelled gowns were astonishingly expensive, requiring not just fine cloth like velvet or satin, but also embroidery done with gold and silver thread. Small armies of seamstresses, embroiderers and jewellers collaborated to create a single dress. Some gowns were so heavy with adornments that the wearer could scarcely move without assistance. Far from being a drawback, this stiffness enhanced their aura. Queens and noblewomen moved slowly and deliberately, not because of ceremony alone, but because the weight of their clothing demanded it. These gowns also reinforced the great divide between classes. While the nobility glittered like living treasure chests, common women wore simple wool or linen. The jewelled gown was a reminder that the elite existed on a different plane, adorned with the very materials most people would never even touch. And like all things Tudor, there were rules. Certain stones and fabrics were reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. A lesser lady dressing above her station risked being accused of arrogance or ambition. The jewelled gown, then, was not fashion alone. It was a weapon in the arsenal of Tudor politics, a dazzling illusion of unshakable power. When Elizabeth I appeared robed in pearls and rubies, she was not simply dressed, she was declaring herself England incarnate, a monarch whose very clothing testified to divine and earthly supremacy. Few garments in history capture the strange mix of bravado, insecurity, and spectacle quite like the codpiece. In Tudor England, this curious addition to men's attire became the ultimate symbol of masculinity, wealth, and, quite bluntly, virility. What began as a practical flap of fabric to cover the gap between a man's hose quickly evolved into something much more, an exaggerated pouch, padded and sometimes even jewelled, that made a man's groin the literal centerpiece of his outfit. The codpiece first emerged in the late 15th century, when men's hose were cut so tightly that they left little modesty in the middle. A small triangular piece of cloth was added to cover the gap. But as the Tudors embraced bold fashion statements, this modest cover grew, swelled, and ballooned until it became impossible to ignore. By the reign of Henry VIII, codpieces had become almost comically large. Some were stuffed with fabric, others reinforced with wire, and the most ostentatious were decorated with embroidery, ribbons, or even jewels. A king or nobleman might walk into court glittering from head to toe, only to have every eye drawn to the padded bulge proclaiming his potency. For Henry VIII, the codpiece was particularly useful. In his younger years, it emphasized his athletic, virile image. Later, as age and illness plagued him, the codpiece became almost a piece of propaganda, suggesting strength and fertility at a time when both were fading. Rumours even swirled that Henry used his codpiece to conceal medical dressings, making it a blend of necessity and bravado. Either way, the codpiece was inseparable from his image as a monarch who embodied masculine dominance. Beyond Henry, the codpiece served as a social marker. A well-padded, richly decorated codpiece announced wealth. You could afford fine tailoring and the frivolity of flaunting yourself. For soldiers, it was tied to notions of virility and courage. In portraits, commanders posed with codpieces as large as their swords, blurring the line between military might and sexual dominance. But like many Tudor fashions, the codpiece eventually collapsed under its own absurdity. By the end of Elizabeth I's reign, it had all but vanished, replaced by more restrained doublets and breeches. Still, for a few decades, the codpiece ruled as the most audacious example of Tudor display, proof that, in this age, even masculinity itself could be exaggerated, padded, and put on parade. In Tudor England, colour was never just decoration. It was destiny written in cloth. Every hue carried a message. Every shade whispered about status, loyalty, or morality. The dyes that gave life to Tudor fashion were expensive, labour-intensive, and often imported from afar. To wear a particular colour was to declare your place in the social order, and to attempt a colour above your rank was to invite suspicion, scorn, or even punishment under the sumptuary laws. The most coveted shade of all was purple, a colour so costly to produce that it was restricted almost entirely to royalty. Derived from rare dyes imported from the Mediterranean, a single ounce required thousands of shellfish. When Henry VIII or Elizabeth I appeared in purple, it was not simply a choice of taste, it was a declaration of their divine right to rule, a reminder that they alone were permitted to embody majesty in such tones. Crimson and scarlet followed closely behind. Produced using cochineal from Spanish colonies and kermes from the Mediterranean, these deep reds were the colours of nobility, power, and ambition. Rich velvet gowns dyed scarlet marked the highborn, while deep crimson cloaks symbolised both martial valour and wealth. Black, though seemingly sombre to modern eyes, was equally potent. Achieving a deep, uniform black required layer upon layer of costly dye, making it a luxury colour. To wear black in Tudor England was to project dignity, gravity, and affluence. It was no coincidence that portraits of Elizabeth I often depicted her in black embroidered with pearls, combining restraint with radiance. For the lower classes, colours were far more muted. Browns, greys, and dull greens, dyed with cheaper local plants like woad, were common for everyday wear. These shades were practical, concealing dirt and wear, but they also reinforced the visual gulf between peasant and courtier. To see a noble dressed in bright vermilion or gleaming gold thread was to be reminded of a world forever out of reach. Yet colour was not only about class, it was also about symbolism. Green, for instance, carried associations with fertility and youth. Blue was linked to the Virgin Mary, a symbol of piety and faith. Gold represented not only wealth, but also divine favour, and to wear it was to cloak oneself in the language of heaven. In the Tudor world, colour was currency. To wear it boldly was to command attention. To be denied, it was to be reminded of your place. Every thread, every shade, every dye was another sentence in the elaborate conversation of power and identity that defined the age. If colour was the language of Tudor status, fabric was its accent. In Tudor England, the very weave of your clothing spoke volumes about your wealth, your rank, and even your moral character. Rich textures were as important as dazzling hues, and the nobility draped themselves in materials so rare and costly that a single gown could equal the price of a peasant's home. Foremost among these was silk, imported from Italy, France, and the Far East. Its sheen made it instantly recognizable, and it quickly became a fabric reserved for the elite. Worn alone or layered beneath slashed sleeves, silk shimmered in candlelight and sunlight alike, ensuring that courtiers literally glowed in royal halls. Velvet followed close behind, thick and plush, a fabric that not only looked luxurious but felt heavy, signalling substance and seriousness. Velvet in crimson or deep green was a staple of noble wardrobes, and its very expense was a barrier against the lower ranks. Satin and damask added further richness. Damask, with its intricate patterns woven directly into the fabric, gave depth and texture to gowns and doublets, while satin's glossy surface created a smooth, almost liquid finish. These were not materials meant for the dirt and toil of daily life. They were meant for display, shimmering proofs that the wearer lived above labour. Fur, too, played its part. A Tudor gown lined with ermine, sable or lynx signalled the wearer's lofty status. Lesser furs, fox, rabbit or lamb, were deemed suitable for those lower down the chain. Fur was warmth, yes, but more importantly, it was hierarchy stitched into the very lining of your coat. Henry VIII adored fur, often appearing in portraits swaddled in vast, fur-lined robes that made him seem larger than life, both literally and symbolically. Even linen and wool, though more common, were carefully graded. The finest linens, bleached to a dazzling white, were used for shirts and smocks close to the body, serving as a canvas for jewels and embroidery. Ordinary folk wore coarse wool in natural tones, durable and practical. But among nobles, even wool could be transformed, dyed rich colours, and woven into fine cloth. The texture of Tudor fashion was never accidental. Rough against smooth, matte against glossy. These contrasts created visual drama, emphasizing wealth through deliberate extravagance. In a society where appearances defined destiny, fabric itself became a tool of power. The Tudor elite did not merely wear clothes. They weaponized texture, weaving their authority into every stitch. In Tudor England, no outfit was complete without the finishing touches. Accessories were not afterthoughts. They were essential declarations of taste, wealth, and identity. A nobleman or lady stepping into court would never appear unfinished. Every hat feather, jewel, and shoe buckle added another layer to the performance of status. Hats were especially important. For men, the flat cap or bonnet, often adorned with feathers and jewelled brooches, was standard at court. These hats could be simple or wildly elaborate, depending on rank. Henry VIII was rarely seen without a broad fur-trimmed cap glittering with gems. For women, hoods were the accessory of choice. The French hood, introduced by Anne Boleyn, framed the face with a rounded edge, allowing a tantalizing glimpse of hair beneath. In contrast, the gabled hood, favoured by Catherine of Aragon, formed a rigid triangular shape, echoing the rooflines of Tudor houses. Each choice was political as much as personal. Adopting one hood over another aligned a woman with a particular faction or fashion trend. Jewellery served as both adornment and declaration. Necklaces of pearls and gold chains draped across gowns, rings sparkled on every finger, and girdles, jewelled belts, cinched the waist. For Elizabeth I, pearls became her signature, symbolising purity and reinforcing her cultivated image as the Virgin Queen. Courtiers, desperate to impress, followed suit, dripping in gemstones even when their estates were drowning in debt. To appear poor in jewellery at court was to appear powerless. Shoes might seem like an afterthought, but in Tudor fashion, even footwear carried meaning. Men's shoes, known as duckbill shoes, were flat, wide, and often stuffed to exaggerate their shape. Some were slashed like sleeves, revealing rich fabrics beneath. Women's shoes, meanwhile, were often hidden under long gowns but still crafted from fine leather, velvet, or silk. For indoor wear, both sexes sometimes used slippers embroidered with gold thread. The wealthy also had pattens, wooden platforms worn under shoes to elevate them above the mud, a practical necessity in a world where streets doubled as sewers. Accessories were more than decoration. They were weapons of first impressions. A noble's fortune could be measured not just in land or titles, but in the glitter of his hatpin or the shimmer of his wife's girdle. In the Tudor court, where appearance was currency, accessories were coins in the richest treasury of all, the body itself. Tudor clothing was never simply about covering the body, it was a carefully woven tapestry of identity, authority, and symbolism. To step into a Tudor gown or doublet was to step into a role, one dictated not only by personal taste, but by the crown itself. Every ruff, every jewel, every puffed sleeve was part of a script that defined who you were allowed to be in the rigid hierarchy of Tudor England. For the monarch, fashion was a stage. Henry VIII's vast fur-lined coats and monstrous codpieces projected dominance, virility, and wealth. Even as his body weakened beneath the burden of age and disease, Elizabeth I turned her gowns into armour of image, each encrusted with pearls, suns, and symbolic embroidery that cast her not just as a queen but as a living icon. She mastered the art of dressing as politics, understanding that a single appearance could reinforce her legitimacy and awe her subjects more powerfully than any speech. For the nobility, clothing became both privilege and prison. They glittered in velvets and jewels, but those luxuries came at staggering expense. Families bankrupted themselves to keep up appearances at court, for to appear poorly dressed was to appear irrelevant. Fashion was as much about survival in politics as it was about beauty. It created allies, drew lines between factions, and allowed ambitious courtiers to show loyalty or superiority with every thread they wore. For the common people, the symbolism was more sobering. Their drab wool tunics and plain dresses marked them as firmly outside the spectacle. They were reminded daily that colour, fabric, and excess were privileges reserved for others. Clothing kept the social order visible at all times, making inequality impossible to ignore. Yet the legacy of Tudor fashion endures far beyond its century. Today, the image of a Tudor ruff or a jewelled gown instantly conjures the grandeur and excess of the age. Fashion historians see in these clothes not only beauty, but also politics, ambition, and propaganda. In many ways, Tudor fashion foreshadowed the modern obsession with image, where what we wear still communicates status, values, and identity. In the end, Tudor fashion was more than a matter of taste. It was the visible expression of power itself. To dress like a Tudor was to participate in a grand performance, one where fabric and thread spoke louder than words, and where identity was stitched, embroidered, and paraded for all to see. To step into a medieval Arab bazaar was to enter the living soul of the city. Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus were not defined only by their mosques, palaces, or schools of learning. They pulsed with life in the sprawling marketplaces, where every sense was overwhelmed. The bazaar was more than a place to buy and sell. It was the stage on which daily life unfolded, where fortunes were made, reputations built, and news spread faster than any courier. From dawn until dusk, the streets were alive with movement. Tents and wooden awnings stretched overhead, shading shoppers from the fierce sun, while narrow lanes wound in twisting paths that seemed endless. The air was thick with aromas that told the story of empire: saffron and cardamom from India, frankincense from Arabia, musk from Central Asia, and the ever-present perfume of roasting lamb and bread pulled fresh from clay ovens. In one alley, you might hear the clang of a coppersmith hammering a pot into shape. In the next, the soft rustle of silks being unfurled before eager buyers. The bazaar was a theatre of voices. Merchants shouted praise of their wares, swearing on their honour that their spices were fresher, their fabrics finer, their prices fairer than the man in the next stall. Haggling was not only expected, but celebrated, a ritual that bound buyer and seller in a dance of wit and patience. To pay the first price offered was a mark of inexperience, even shame, yet commerce was only half the story. The bazaar was also the gossip mill of the city, where news of distant wars, court intrigues, or the latest scandal in the governor's palace spread like wildfire. Travellers, pilgrims, and traders carried stories from as far as Andalusia and Samarkand, making the market a hub of cultural exchange. Here, a scholar might debate theology beside a butcher's stall, while a poet recited verses to a curious crowd. For ordinary citizens, the bazaar was the centre of community life. It was where a father might choose a bride's dowry cloth, where a mother brought her children to taste sweet honey cakes, and where neighbours shared whispered news over cups of steaming coffee or tea. In these bustling lanes, the city's identity was woven together, not in stone or parchment, but in trade, conversation, and daily human connection. If the medieval Arab bazaar had a signature, it was its fragrance. To walk its winding streets was to be enveloped in a tapestry of aromas, each one a thread linking the city to lands far beyond its walls. Spices and perfumes were not merely commodities, they were luxuries, medicines, status symbols, and in some cases, weapons of diplomacy. Stalls overflowed with baskets of saffron, its golden threads worth their weight in silver, carefully measured out by merchants who guarded them as if they were jewels. Cinnamon and cloves arrived from India and the Indonesian Isles, transported by camel caravans and dhows across seas and deserts. Black pepper, so commonplace today, was then a luxury spice, a prized seasoning for elite households. Cardamom pods, nutmeg, and ginger were stacked in neat piles, their strong fragrances perfuming the air long before the customer reached the stall. Perfume sellers added another layer to this sensory theatre. In their shops, carved wooden shelves displayed bottles filled with rosewater from Persia, musk from Tibet, ambergris carried by sailors from the Indian Ocean, and frankincense harvested in Arabia. Perfumes were more than adornments. They played a central role in religious rituals, courtly life, and medicine. Physicians prescribed them to balance humours, while nobles used them to mark social distinction. The Prophet Muhammad himself had praised perfume, and in medieval Islamic society, scent was considered a reflection of cleanliness, piety, and refinement. Every purchase came with performance. Sellers invited customers to inhale the sharp bite of saffron or rub a drop of oil on their skin. They boasted of distant origins, from the mountains of Yemen, from the ships of Gujarat, and sometimes exaggerated, for in the bazaar, storytelling was as important as the product itself. Buyers, in turn, haggled not only over price, but over the prestige of the purchase. To walk home with a pouch of imported cinnamon was to carry a symbol of wealth just as much as food. But spices and perfumes were more than luxuries. They were bridges between worlds. Each whiff was a reminder that Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus were not isolated cities, but crossroads of empire. The scents of the bazaar told of caravans trudging across deserts, ships sailing monsoon winds, and merchants weaving a network that stretched from China to Andalusia. In this fragrant economy, the bazaar was not just local, it was global, its air thick with the breath of half the world. If spices gave the bazaar its fragrance, textiles gave it its colour. The markets of Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus dazzled with fabric, rolls of silk glowing like liquid light, carpets spread across the ground like woven gardens, and bolts of cotton stacked in every hue imaginable. In a society where clothing reflected rank, wealth, and taste, textiles were not just commodities, but powerful symbols of identity. Silk, the most coveted of all, came from China and Central Asia via the Great Silk Road, as well as from Byzantine and Persian looms. To touch it was to feel luxury itself, smooth, shimmering, and impossibly fine compared to coarse wool or linen. In the bazaars, merchants unfolded their silks with theatrical care, letting the fabric ripple in the sunlight to impress buyers. Wealthy families bought it for wedding garments, nobles draped it across cushions and curtains, and rulers gifted it to foreign ambassadors as tokens of prestige. Carpets were another treasure. From Persia, Anatolia, and even local workshops, carpets were both functional and artistic, their patterns alive with geometry, flowers, and sacred symbolism. A carpet was not merely something to walk on. It was prayer space, status symbol, and heirloom. In mosques, carpets softened the floor for worshippers. In homes, they decorated walls and floors alike. Buyers in the bazaar examined knots and dyes with care, for a fine carpet could last generations and command a price as high as jewels. Cotton and wool, though less expensive, were no less vital. Egypt in particular exported high-quality cotton, dyed in bright blues and reds. Ordinary people bought sturdy wool or linen for everyday garments, while merchants purchased in bulk to resell across distant lands. Dyers' quarters filled alleys with vats of indigo, madder root, and saffron, staining fabrics in brilliant shades that transformed the bazaar into a festival of colour. Every transaction was alive with ritual. Buyers tugged at the weave to test strength, held fabric to the light to see its quality, and always haggled fiercely over price. Sellers responded with boasts of origin, Persian knots, Damascus dyes, knowing that provenance carried as much value as the cloth itself. To wander the textile stalls was to witness a pageant of wealth and aspiration. Here, fabric was more than material. It was memory, status, and connection. Each thread bound the bazaar to the wider world, weaving together China, Persia, India, and the Mediterranean into one vast, colourful tapestry. If the medieval bazaar dazzled the eye and intoxicated the nose, it also overwhelmed the ear. The market was a symphony of sound, an unending chorus that blended commerce, music, and storytelling into the daily rhythm of urban life. To step into the bazaar was to be immersed in a soundscape where every noise had meaning. The loudest voices belonged to the merchants. They cried out their wares with practiced rhythm, their chants designed to cut through the clamour. Fresh figs, sweet dates, best prices in Cairo, echoed beside the sharp bark of the spice seller, boasting of saffron from distant lands. Haggling filled the air. Buyers and sellers engaged in playful arguments, both parties aware that the performance of bargaining was half the transaction. Shouts rose, laughter followed, and when agreement was finally reached, it was sealed with a handshake and often a blessing. May God bring you profit, yet the bazaar was not all commerce. Between stalls, musicians played lutes, flutes, and drums, their melodies weaving through the crowd like invisible threads. Some were professionals hired by coffeehouse owners to attract patrons. Others were wandering minstrels who lived from coin to coin, their songs carrying tales of heroes, lovers, and saints. The rhythms of darbuka drums and the twang of the oud created a soundtrack that transformed shopping into spectacle. Storytellers added another layer. In shaded courtyards or near the entrances of mosques, men gathered around hakawatis, narrators who spun epics like the adventures of Antar or episodes from the ever-expanding 1001 Nights. Crowds leaned in as voices rose and fell, punctuated by gasps, chuckles, or cheers. These tales were more than entertainment. They carried moral lessons, preserved cultural memory, and spread news disguised as story. The sounds of animals completed the cacophony. Donkeys brayed as they hauled sacks of grain, camels groaned under loads of carpets, and the cries of water sellers rang through the lanes. "Cold water! Fresh water!" Children darted between stalls, laughing and shouting, while the clang of blacksmiths and the rasp of wood carvers added sharp metallic notes to the mix. The bazaar's soundscape was not chaos but life in motion. Every voice, every instrument, every animal call was part of a larger harmony. It was a living concert where trade, art, and community blended, reminding all who entered that the bazaar was not just a market, but the very heartbeat of the city. The medieval Arab bazaar was not only an economic engine, it was a political arena. Behind the cries of merchants and the perfume of spices lurked the invisible machinery of governance, taxation, and surveillance. Rulers understood that whoever controlled the market controlled the lifeblood of the city. Every stall, every caravan of goods that entered the gates, was subject to taxes. Officials appointed by the Sultan or Caliph patrolled the markets, ensuring dues were collected on everything from silk to sesame seeds. These taxes funded armies, mosques, and public works, making the bazaar a treasury as much as a marketplace. The mutasib, or market inspector, was a particularly feared figure. His duty was to enforce fair trade, check the weights and measures of merchants, and punish fraud. If a butcher's scales were rigged, the muhtasib could close his shop or even order him flogged. Justice was public and immediate, meant to reassure customers that the bazaar was safe from exploitation. But beyond economics, the bazaar was a hotbed of politics and intrigue. Here, gossip flowed faster than coins. Merchants traded not only goods, but information. News of military campaigns, whispers of court scandals, rumours of succession. Sultans and governors often planted informants in the markets, disguised as common buyers, to listen for unrest. A careless joke about taxation, or a muttered complaint about the ruler, could find its way back to the palace by evening. The bazaar also provided a stage for displays of authority. Processions of rulers or governors often began or ended there, reminding the people of their presence. Edicts were read aloud in the market square, ensuring maximum audience. In times of crisis, such as famine or war, rulers might appear personally to order the fair distribution of grain, knowing that the bazaar was where their decisions were most visible. At the same time, the market gave power to ordinary people. A boycott of a corrupt merchant or collective grumbling about taxes could ripple upward into real political pressure. Leaders ignored the mood of the bazaar at their peril, for it was there that the pulse of the city could be felt most strongly. Thus, the bazaar was more than commerce. It was a place where rulers and ruled met, in an ongoing negotiation of power, where taxes filled coffers, spies gathered whispers, and politics mingled with trade as seamlessly as perfume with air. In the medieval Arab bazaar, faith was never separate from daily life. It infused every lane, every shop, every transaction. Unlike modern markets, where commerce and religion are often divided, the bazaar existed in the shadow of mosques, madrasas, and shrines. Faith was not only practiced within the walls of sacred spaces, it was lived openly in the heart of the marketplace. The call to prayer structured the rhythm of the bazaar. 5 times a day, the muezzin's voice echoed from minarets, rising above the noise of bargaining and clattering hooves. At once, shopkeepers drew curtains over their stalls, customers paused in mid-haggle, and men streamed to the nearest mosque or prayer corner. Markets in Cairo might fall suddenly silent, save for the shuffle of sandals on stone, before bursting back to life with renewed energy after prayer. Charity, too, was an inseparable part of bazaar culture. Merchants were expected not only to sell but to give. A portion of profits was often donated as zakat, alms mandated by Islamic law, or as voluntary sadaqah. In some bazaars, water fountains and public kitchens, funded by charitable endowments, waqf, stood at the entrances, ensuring that the poor and travellers did not go thirsty or hungry. To refuse generosity was to risk both divine displeasure and social scorn. Ritual purity shaped how goods were handled. Butchers adhered to Islamic rules of slaughter, and market inspectors ensured that food was prepared according to religious standards. Perfume sellers invoked hadiths praising cleanliness, while scribes often copied Quranic verses for sale alongside poetry. Faith was woven even into commerce itself. Contracts and receipts might open with, "In the name of God," reminding buyer and seller that every transaction carried moral weight. Religious festivals turned the bazaar into a stage of celebration. During Ramadan, markets lit up with lanterns, sweet sellers displayed trays of honey cakes, and nights were filled with music after the fast. On Eid, bazaars were crowded with families buying new clothes, perfumes, and gifts, their joy spilling into streets already decorated with banners and lights. The bazaar was never only about goods, it was about the soul of the city. Here, devotion walked hand in hand with commerce, prayers mingled with bargaining, and charity softened the harshness of trade. In the medieval Arab world, to shop was also to live one's faith in public, surrounded by the shared rituals that bound community and belief together. The medieval Arab bazaar was not only a marketplace for goods, it was a crossroads of civilizations. Few other places in the world brought together such a diversity of people, languages and traditions. Cairo, Baghdad and Damascus stood at the junction of global trade routes, and their bazaars reflected this international reach. To walk through them was to encounter half the known world in a single afternoon. Foreign merchants were common sights. Persian traders in flowing robes offered carpets and metalwork. Indian merchants unloaded spices, precious stones and cotton. Greek and Italian dealers carried glassware, wines, and fine cloth. From the African interior came ivory, gold, and enslaved people, while caravans from Central Asia brought horses, furs, and exotic birds. Each group spoke its own tongue, but Arabic served as the lingua franca of trade, allowing deals to flow smoothly across cultural boundaries. The bazaar also functioned as an embassy without walls. Diplomats and envoys often visited markets to observe local wealth and gauge the mood of the city. Deals struck here could shape alliances, while disputes could escalate into political crises. In this way, bazaars served as informal stages of diplomacy, where trust and suspicion mingled as tangibly as the scents of cinnamon and musk. But the cultural exchange was not limited to politics or commerce. It extended to knowledge. In Baghdad's bazaars, booksellers sold volumes of philosophy, medicine and astronomy, many translated from Greek, Persian and Sanskrit into Arabic. Scholars browsed alongside merchants, and ideas travelled with goods. A mathematical treatise might leave Baghdad in a caravan bound for Damascus, only to end up in Andalusia, influencing scholars in Cordoba. The bazaar was a classroom as much as a marketplace, where East met West in ink as well as in silk. Everyday interactions also created subtle cultural blending. Cooks experimented with foreign spices to create new dishes. Artisans borrowed motifs from imported textiles. Poets wove exotic imagery into their verses. Even gossip carried traces of this cosmopolitanism. As stories from distant lands mingled with local tales, the Arab bazaar, then, was more than a place of trade. It was a meeting ground of worlds. Here, cultures collided, mingled, and reshaped one another. Standing in a crowded alleyway, surrounded by goods and voices from across continents, a medieval shopper might feel as if the entire globe had come to their doorstep. Though the bazaar was a marketplace, it was also a stage for entertainment and a meeting ground for community life. People came not only to buy spices, silks or carpets, but to see and be seen, to enjoy diversions, and to connect with the pulse of the city. The bazaar was the medieval Arab world's theatre, cafe, and town square all in one. Coffee houses and tea stalls quickly became magnets for conversation. Men gathered to drink steaming cups, sweetened with sugar or flavoured with cardamom, while debating poetry, politics, or the latest rumours from the palace. These gatherings blurred the line between leisure and news. A coffee house was where one might learn of a new sultan's decree, hear a recitation of love verses, or even witness a heated argument about theology. Entertainment spilled into the lanes. Street performers dazzled crowds with acrobatics, juggling, and feats of strength. Snake charmers and trained monkeys drew circles of curious children and travellers, their laughter rising above the marketplace noise. Musicians with lutes and drums provided a soundtrack to daily life, while dancers, often accompanied by clapping and chants, performed in open courtyards or at festivals. The storytellers, the Hakawatis, were among the most beloved figures. Sitting on stools or platforms, they recited epics and romances that transported audiences far beyond the bazaar's walls. Tales of heroes like Antar, or fantastical adventures from what would become 1001 Nights, were shared in episodes, keeping listeners returning day after day to hear the next installment. These stories carried moral lessons, preserved cultural memory, and reminded audiences of their shared heritage. The bazaar was also a place of sociability for women, though their participation was shaped by custom and region. Women shopped for household goods, fabrics, and perfumes, often accompanied by relatives or servants. Within these errands, friendships were reinforced, dowries negotiated, and family alliances strengthened. The bazaar thus became a social bridge, binding households into the wider fabric of urban life. Festivals transformed the market into a carnival. During Ramadan, lanterns lit the night, sweet sellers offered trays of honey pastries, and storytellers kept crowds enchanted until dawn. On holidays like Eid, entire families flocked to the bazaar in their finest clothes, filling the alleys with joy and celebration. The bazaar was never only about trade, it was where people gathered to live. Through laughter, stories, music, and shared ritual, it became a living stage of entertainment and social life, the true theatre of the medieval city. Long after the traders packed away their wares and the storytellers finished their tales, the legacy of the medieval Arab bazaar continued to shape the world. These marketplaces were more than local centres of trade. They were engines of globalization, centuries before the word existed. From Cairo's Khan al-Khalili to Baghdad's bustling souks and Damascus's al-Hamidiyya, the bazaar defined the city and radiated its influence across continents. Economically, the bazaars linked regions into a vast network of exchange. Spices from India, silks from China, ivory from Africa, and furs from Central Asia all converged here to be resold and carried westward into Europe. Without the bazaar as an organizing hub, the flow of goods along the Silk Road and across the Mediterranean would have faltered. These markets were the arteries of medieval commerce, pumping wealth and variety into societies that had never before known such abundance. Culturally, the bazaars were equally transformative. They spread not only products but also ideas. Mathematical concepts from India, medical texts from Greece, poetry from Persia, and technologies like papermaking from China. The booksellers of Baghdad's markets, for instance, helped make the city a centre of learning, where knowledge was translated, debated, and transmitted. In this sense, the bazaar was a library without walls, where wisdom travelled with the same speed as silk or cinnamon. Socially, the bazaar left its mark as the meeting ground of communities. It was the place where rich and poor brushed shoulders, where merchants and scholars conversed, where strangers became neighbours through the shared rituals of bargaining and storytelling. This social glue gave medieval cities their vitality and resilience, binding diverse populations into a single civic identity. The echoes of the medieval bazaar still linger today. Modern markets, from Istanbul's Grand Bazaar to Morocco's souks, preserve the architecture, scents, and rhythms of their ancestors. Even in digital marketplaces, where haggling is replaced by clicks, the essence of the bazaar remains: exchange, connection, and the mingling of cultures. In the end, the medieval Arab bazaar was never only about trade. It was the living heart of cities, the crossroads of empires, and the stage on which daily life, politics, and culture unfolded. Its legacy reminds us that marketplaces are not just places to buy and sell. They are the arenas where civilizations meet, create, and endure.